All right, so the past year and a half has been a roller coaster for everyone. How did the pandemic and the lockdowns affect Kero Kero Bonito's artistic process?
It certainly, we actually went more, well, we were separate and we have been working separately almost throughout, less so recently. But even out of lockdowns, we kind of were meeting up, but we're still working more at our own stations. And even filming, and like the way we approach certain performances was such as well. So it was kind of a fun, and doing B-roll and stuff like that. So it was like became quite fun actually, more than just pandemic. It was like, okay, we can do this,
Yeah, it necessitated I suppose, a reliance on a state that we have sometimes inhabited before, a state that we've sometimes been in before, which is that when we're separate, you can still work together. It's just different to bouncing ideas off each other in a room. And for example, Sarah actually set up her own recording setup at home. Before that, all recordings were done, all KKB recordings were done together. Vocal recordings, anyway. I mean, the tracks were done at home separately, often or together, as Jamie was saying. So that was a big change. But in terms of the creative process, in terms of writing songs, I mean, often it would be quite piecemeal anyway. It would be, all right, well, me and Jamie have got a beat. Sarah, do you want to write a rap over this? Or Sarah sends through some lyrics and we set it to music. And that doesn't necessarily have to happen in the same room. So actually that side of things did remain the same. But I would say, I mean, it's definitely overall, I think, probably slowed it down because the freewheeling nature of a normal life lived with people communicating without even really thinking too hard about it, and it is definitely it's definitely not the world we're in right now. And also, for example, even though it's actually a massive new skill that we have in Sarah now being effectively a vocal producer, we before in sessions in person would be able to give feedback very quickly, and you don't even think about it. Someone would sing something, you go, why don't you try this instead? Why don't you try doing a bend on this note? Whereas now it's a kind of feedback tennis match, and if anyone's anyone like me, sending an email back will take ages and ages, and I'll be thinking, actually, what's the best feedback I can give here or whatever. And that definitely slows things down in a way that I hadn't even imagined. But I do quite like working remotely. I mean, I think that it can be easier to work with people remotely than in person, because I think if you're in person, you feel on the spot and you just rush out the first thing you can think of, which might not be your best work. When you're given something by someone else, because we've done some other collaborations which have been subject to this similar remote process recently. And actually, then you're applying your solo creative process, which is good because you have time to consider it and you really get into it. And then what you're handing back isn't just something you dashed off in an hour in a session in some studio. It's the thing that you really spend a lot of time considering, which is almost always better. Not always, but almost always better, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Are you guys still recording remotely now?
Yeah, we're still pretty much like recording. Yeah, like I do most, like, yeah, pretty much most of the vocals are still from my room. Yeah.
Well, here's the interesting thing, because now Sarah has that skill. It might be something that sticks around to some extent, even if we don't need to do it, you know. In my experience, it actually depends on the song. I think there are some songs where it makes more sense to have everyone in the room, or at least in the zone, to be able to keep it going, keep it on its path to keep it on the path to where it needs to go. But there are other songs where actually whoever's singing it has a really clear idea, and you just get back what you get back, and it's fine. You know, I think Well Rested, I don't think I think that was completely remote. The actual recordings, I don't think we were in the same room at all when that song was recorded vocally. I mean, or well, actually at all because of lockdown, obviously.
Yeah, it's really cool. So Kero Kero Bonito has dabbled in a lot of different sounds and genres over the years, beginning with the sugary electropop of Intro Bonito and Bonito Generation, then a more rock-influenced twee pop sound of Time and Place, then a transition back into electronica with Civilization 1 and 2. What do you think has informed the shift back into electronic instrumentation?
I think artists, exploratory artists, because not all artists are like this, but ones that do shift and move sound and explore different territories, I think have a tendency to gravitate towards the inverse of what they're over familiar with. And not I'm saying making using interesting guitar effects or recording weird old electronic gadgets or electric gadgets more than we're talking pre-digital stuff that like Time and Place uses. I'm not saying that ever gets really boring, but when you've made a whole album of that and spent a year and a half touring it, I think you do start to see the appeal of something a little different. And I think that even though Time and Place did use electronics, I think that the world of pure synthesizers did seem appealing because it was slightly novel again, but also because I think it is in many ways my background. I mean, Jamie and I as musicians both have a mixed background, but Jamie has also always made tunes on Logic or whatever, and so it's especially inviting when it's territory that in many ways plays your strengths and means that you have a refreshed perspective on something that you're probably pretty good at anyway, and relative to other stuff. I mean, I ain't boasting anything, but yeah, I think overall that's probably the thing. I personally do have a feeling that the thing I'm best at is using synths to make songs, I think.
I'd say when it comes to a whole catalogue, we are definitely inspired by artists of the past who have kind of, moved around, shall we say. And I think we might have mentioned it before, but there is this Bowie quote, which is like about you've got to keep your toes just, you know what I mean? Like just not too deep, but like not too shallow kind of thing.
Just touching the floor of the swimming pool.
Yeah, so like that's it really. We like challenging ourselves, but we're not going to go and do something real silly, More specifically, with more recent things, it's been a like Civilization and Time and Place were actually more connected as well, because they're kind of we want to explore more of the kind of hardware, electronic side of things, the dustier side of things there.
That's true, and actually, I think it's worth mentioning that. I mean, it's worth mentioning that almost all records in the career of an exploratory artist will be snapshots of these different elements of a record, and those different elements are changing at different rates to each other. So an artist might get bored of synths after one album, but they might be interested in writing about existentialism for 2 albums, right? So, and you can see how all of these things would layer up. And I think that as much as there are shifts, KKB's music, there are also things that are changing at a slower rate as well, for sure. And as Jamie said, the Civilization EPs are very much connected to time and place, mainly in a thematic way, but also in their use of old equipment, definitely.
Yeah, and I definitely love that Bowie quote as well. I think it can definitely be applied to what you guys have been doing lately.
Yeah, it's a really handy thing to just bear in mind, I think.
Yeah.
It's never put us wrong, that concept so far.
The Civilization EPs both have cover art reminiscent of hieroglyphics and ancient cave paintings. This imagery is a major shift away from the bright and colorful aesthetics of Kero Kero Bonito's earlier work. What are the origins of this shift in imagery?
I guess like with the shift in imagery, for this Civilization series, we were like exploring like a lost civilization that could have existed in the past or the future, and like looking at like stuff like the Egyptian like writings, or like there's this like book called Codex Seraphini. Gus needs to help me.
Yeah, the Codex Seraphinianus.
Yeah, but written by Luigi Serafini, and it's like this encyclopedia of this alien world, and he used like a writing that was like doesn't have like any meaning that we can like identify. And yeah, we were looking at a lot of things like and yeah, that's what inspired us.
The idea, the core idea that I remember us talking about that I think really relates to all of that was this idea. Imagine if KKB were aliens and we were marketing ourselves to humans, and we had got some things right but some things wrong, so it had a kind of uncanniness. Or on the flip side, imagine if 1,000 years time people are exploring KKB, rediscovering KKB, and they don't use the Roman alphabet, or they use some other language, and they recognize some aspects of this the presentation of this thing. Maybe they recognize it was a music ensemble, maybe they recognize some of the costume references, etc., but they don't really understand the full picture. And we want to deliver that kind of feeling to people right now. And the reason I think we did that was because it like the Codex Seraphinianus, it sends a message about semantics, about the way we understand the world and the way we understand ourselves and communicate with each other about that. And I mean, who's to say exactly why that felt relevant, but I think it hasn't stopped feeling relevant, which is quite interesting.
Definitely. So the Civilization EPs also tackle a lot of contemporary issues through an almost apocalyptic and existential lens, meditating on the future of mankind and civilization at large on tracks like Well Rested and The River. What do you think drew KKB to discuss these issues?
There's certainly a few things, but I mentioned one straight away, which was in 2018. Was it? Yeah, 2018, and we saw, we actually witnessed the Chico fire, the wildfire, went underneath the cloud that was nearby and everything, you know. So that certainly was something you'll never forget, you know. And as musicians or whatever, you know, you end it gets there, and that's when the fires come, is to certainly inspired by that. And I'm sure other people will elaborate, but one of the things as well was time and place was more of a personal, let's say, like looking at our personal narratives and where we're at, where, you know, where we might sit. And civilization, on the other hand, can then be where humanity's at, you know, and that kind of what the narrative is for humanity. And then obviously parallel and stuff like that as well.
I think that's a really, really, what's the word? A really concise way of putting it, actually. And I think one thing that I think the discussion around, particularly the politics of identity, has thrown up over the last decade is that it pays to look inside yourself and understand what you're about as much as, and actually probably almost certainly more than the things that people are quick to exoticize or judge or hate or fear. And because then only then can you really engage with those things on a on a on a on a on a level that of engagement that really makes sense and is fair. And I think that it's interesting looking at different human cultures throughout history, because in a way they are as different as different human cultures around the globe in the same moment. And reflecting it back on ourselves, we then get a better sense of who we are. And that means we have a better way forward in terms of communicating with other people. And so really, I think that I think starting from Time and Place, I was really struck by how important it is to make things that have yourself prominently in them. Not that we didn't do that before, actually. I mean, obviously, I think as a producer, I think it's very obvious that there's tons of ourselves in Bonito Generation and Intro Bonito, but maybe on a almost hyper local level, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I see that. So 210420 is a track that details the state of everyday life at the beginning of the pandemic and is reminiscent of the Japanese city pop movement of the 70s and 80s in its day-to-day life or day in the life storytelling and funky instrumental. I know that KKB's earlier work was heavily influenced by Japanese music, particularly the Japanese hip hop of Halkali. Was it a conscious decision to try to make a KKB city pop song, or where did that idea originate?
That's an interesting question, because I would say that there was a prior song in the KKB discography, which was a fairly, I wouldn't say it was a purely calculated city pop imitation, but we had made an instrumental which was similar to tracks like Treat Her Like a Lady by the Temptations, or maybe even Aleem or something like that. This kind of very African American 80s electronic sort of soul boogie zone. And then Sarah came up with the idea of, just generally not tied to this instrumental, of making a song called Big City as a response to the song Small Town from our first mixtape. And so Big City, that instrumental became attached to that title, and so it actually ended up becoming a kind of city pop moment, even though it wasn't really what's a good Kanako Wada or Mickey and I we were imitating. It was almost more like D Train or I mean, I think Temptations are a great example. Anything that Treat Her Like a Lady is clearly the influence for Big City, actually. But it goes to show actually how there's something interesting to be said for the delineation of city pop as a style, which of course does have a very specific cultural context, But what I think is sometimes lost in the discussion of that genre, which I love. I mean, I love that style. I think that obviously some incredible records in that style, and it shouldn't be divorced from its very specific context, which is different to the records I'm about to mention. But I do think it is also not talked about enough how it is clearly a stylistic response to records that were coming out of America in the preceding years. And I think even by the time, maybe even by the time City Pop was gathering steam as a cultural force, a style that maybe wasn't so hip in Euro America, or especially America. But as for 210420, the genesis of that song was actually Arthur Russell, because he has a track called You and Me Both, which is a kind of, like a lot of his, especially this posthumously released stuff, but even a lot of his released stuff actually, his contemporaneously released stuff, feels very off the cuff. It feels like he's improvising a song on his keyboard while a drum machine just plays, and it's a kind of swung drum machine loop. It's almost New Jack or proto New Jack-ish. And I love that track, and I just wanted to do something a bit similar. So the idea was to set up a drum loop and play some chords over the top. And the chords, it ended up becoming a bit more tightly wound than You and Me Both. I mean, the beautiful thing about an exercise like this is it doesn't have to sound, the exercise would have actually been a failure if we just recreated You and Me Both, right? It actually ended up being a more tightly wound song, with the beat actually changing a little bit more than it does in You and Me Both, and the bars being way more defined, and the different sections being way more defined, and all of that. But what's interesting is that our songwriterly impulse to imitate You and Me Both ended up taking us down a more designed path that actually was probably more like Yumi Matsutoya or Cindy's productions, which is actually quite funny. I mean, maybe there's just a kind of an impulsive tendency within us to sound like city pop for some reason. I don't know, but yeah. I mean, also the other thing I would say that song is influenced by is maybe the less funk driven, but also somewhat jazz and funk driven songwriting of 70s people like Todd Rundgren and the solo Carole King stuff, and also indeed the Japanese response to that. I mean, I mentioned Yumi Matsutoya and her earlier Yumi Arai stuff. Definitely, that's a big influence on a lot of KKB stuff. And yeah, so again, I would come back to the point that yes, I mean, city pop, love that stuff, unquestionably an influence in our melting pot, but also a lot of the predecessors for that kind of music, we might have just been copying the same things, you know.
Oh yeah, it's funny you mentioned big city, because yeah, instrumentally even more so, I can see city pop being applied there.
And it's funny because I think once we decided that the song was called Big City, even though the original instrumental was in that technical funk electronic R&B zone already, when we knew it was going to be called Big City, I think we sort of made it a little bit more city pop. So it was only after we'd written the lyrics that we put in the sort of D50 style, Fantasia style thing that happens in the chorus. And that is actually a bit more city pop than the more analog sounds you'd get in Treat Her Like a Lady. So it's kind of funny how, you know, the mind takes you to those places.
Yeah. So I also wanted to talk about your collaboration with Bug Snacks. It seems like Kero Kero Bonito has been influenced by video game music since the beginning, so it only makes sense that you'd eventually make an original theme song for one. I definitely think that Bugsnax was a suitable collaboration for KKB, as the game's artwork fits perfectly with your Bonito Generation era sound. How did this collaboration come to be?
Definitely, well, shout out Young Horses, the developers. You know, they obviously saw a potential to have a tune, you know, that can work. You know, because they approached us first, you know, and it actually was just before the pandemic, you know. So, but I believe the turnaround was relatively quick, and I'll pass on though to.
Yeah, Bugsnax was the first song I recorded by myself in lockdown with my new mic. So it was a big challenge for me figuring the tech side of things. But yeah, yeah. But yeah, it was really fun to work on the track. Like the game is like, I love how like just trying to explain what the game is, it sounds very crazy, which I really like. So it's been really fun to work on something like, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Do you guys see a future in more video game soundtracks?
Yeah, definitely. Like, would love to do more game soundtracks. We're always up for it.
Yeah, why not? You know, it'd be wicked.
Yeah, it's definitely a bucket list item for me. I think the dream would be, my dream anyway, would be to do a soundtrack for a game that allowed a bit of, I mean, I guess every creative person wants this, right? But a bit of boundary pushing or something a little bit subversive and definitely experimental. I mean, I think of the soundtracks for games like Earthbound. I mean, just as a soundtrack, that's completely insane. The sampling's insane. And it was really encouraging. I mean, I think Shiga Satoru really encouraged Tanaka and Suzuki to just go nuts and try and do things that the SNES hadn't really done before, the SNES soundtrack hadn't really done before, and to very consciously reference real music, but in this really surreal, crazy way. So I think that's a blueprint in so many ways. But also things like Romania 203, which is a really, really interesting game that was actually created by its composer Tomoko Sasaki, and she is, how do I explain this? In the game, there is a fictional idol group or sort of pop act called Sarani Poggi, and the in-game protagonist is a fan of this pop act. But then, and so she made songs for Sarani Poggi, the pop act, that function as these sort of fictional songs in the game. But then they actually made it real, and Sarani Poggi was brought into the real world as a pop act, releasing albums on real record labels and actually doing real stuff. And it's the same Sarani Poggi, and that concept is just, and obviously the songs are great. They're really great band, but that kind of very subversive concept is really appealing to me. I don't think we would be the band to just make you a concept, to make you a couple of hours of orchestral music. There's enough people that can do that. But I think something really interesting, there are so many interesting things that can be done with an art form like that.
Yeah, definitely. I actually didn't know about those origins. In what was the game called?
It's called Romania 203, and it's a weird, it's a Dreamcast game. And yes, Sarani Poggi were created for that game, but then it was like, fuck it, Sarani Poggi we're going to release real albums and like do real stuff.
Yeah,
and it's
just I'm gonna have to check that out.
The first couple of albums were very cool, sort of early 2000s, sort of utopian club pop feeling, sort of lots of poppy garage and poppy jazz house vibe. And what's so appealing about that idea, I think, is that it blurs the line between the fantastical and the real. Because this band, which you conceived of as a fictional fantasy band, which is somehow more exciting than a real band, are actually now a real band. So you can go and see the band or buy the CD of the band that your character in Romania likes. I mean, that's just such a wonderful concept, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So
That's it. Though. That's the standard. That's the standard for,
yeah, yeah,
for our collaboration. If it can be that.
yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be that. It's got to be that good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'd love to see like a KKB like digital band or something like in a game or something. I think that could be really cool.
There are crazy ways it could work now. Crazy ways. I mean, I'm not even going to go into the ways it could work, but yeah, just off the top of my head, I can think of some pretty bizarre. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be even that we were KKB. It could be something else. But yeah, there's so many. Even now, even with video game history pretty established, I think there are a lot of interesting ideas you could pull off in that world, in that
Yeah,
zone.
yeah. Even like alter ego, like gorillas kind of thing. Yeah.
Right,
Oh,
for sure. Or like
influence.
band or something where a band maybe does lots of different bands' music, pretends to be several different bands, or all kinds of things. Yeah, I could go on. I could go on a
Yeah,
big rabbit hole
definitely.
there.
Well, I guess we'll also take a GTA radio station as well or something. That do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
That'd be cool.
definitely wouldn't say no to that. What's so funny about that stuff, and I think of stuff like that, like Need for Speed or FIFA, or these kinds of games.
Yes,
Their music is iconic in a slightly different way. It's because I mean, I would always say I think that the most iconic video game music is which is made for the game. But at the same time, actually, you know, I got into the Jam because they were on FIFA 2004. You know, a lot of people know Promised Land by Joe Smooth because it was in GTA San Andreas. That's actually pretty iconic in a totally different way.
That's what I mean. Like we take both sides. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. So, with a relative return to normalcy in sight, what can we expect from Kero Kero Bonito within the next few years? Aside from the video game soundtrack.
We are certainly working on things, and that is not civilization free. Yeah, potential
I think
in the future as well.
and we definitely want to start playing shows again.
It would, I guess, on a real note, it would be more Northern Hemisphere for now. Which is the stuff you got to work, you know, like like sensitively with, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always a tricky question to answer without spoiling the surprise, but at the same time, at the same time, giving people enough of an idea that there are actually pretty cool things happening. So that's what I'll say. Expect something that we think is cool.
That is full blown guarantee.
Yeah.
Only cool. Yeah.
Sorry, are you guys gonna tour the Civilization EPs as well? Or I guess number 2?
Well, that largely the extent of anything like that would largely depend on the pretty immediate COVID situation, which doesn't look that great. But that said, we would like to try and make something happen if it could.
Definitely. Yeah. And if you can say, I guess, is there going to be another shift in sound for KKB?
That's a good question. I will say that in my opinion, what we're working on now is not territory we've worked on. It's not territory we've worked in before, but and I would say this also is equally true for Time and Place and Civilization. There are clues that hint towards it in the older KKB discography. And I was thinking the other day about how actually, even without realizing it, I think Intro Bonito has clues for all of the things we've done since. Obviously, it was an obvious press. Obviously, it preceded Bonito Generation, but also the existential malaise in Time and Place is exhibited in a song like I'd Rather Sleep, whereas the exploration of ancient traditional worldwide rhythms in songs like Let's Go to the Forest preceded Civilization. So there might be something in that lot that suggests what we're about to do as well.
Dust off the CD. Dust
Yeah.
off the Intro Bonito.
Yeah, get the expensive
Yeah.
Japanese import from
Go-
Discogs.
Yeah.
And yeah. Go from there.
Magnifying glass. Yeah.
I'm gonna be listening closely. I'm gonna see what I can find.
Yeah, do a bit of detective work.
Yeah.
It's like, is it going to be the new jazz?
Yeah.
Free jazz? Free jazz, I mean. Free jazz.
Like country.
Is it just going to be a whole album of radio jingles like the little interlude Bonito jingle?